Brendan Hoffman, I'm going to start with you. Asbestos is now banned in much of the world, but demand continues from countries like India, Thailand, and the Philippines, and of course production continues in asbestos. And one of the striking things about your video is that no one is really questioning that. There's a sense that this is going to go forward and happen, and is there not a sense of what the risks are involved in the production of this, and what do the citizens of Asbestos see as their future?
Well, that's a good question. Yeah, you're right. A lot of people that we talked to, we talked to a lot of people in the town, asking them the obvious questions about health. Because when we went in, we assumed that was going to be, at least for some people, a major issue. And this film is not really about the health impacts of asbestos, because honestly, people there are not concerned about it. And what everyone told us, and honestly, I did the best research that I could to dig deeper. There are two different kinds of asbestos, and everyone there is firmly convinced that the kind of asbestos that they mine is far less dangerous than other types, and it's not something that they're concerned about at all. They wear respirators when they're working in the factory and stuff, but people in town in general, yeah, they're not concerned about the health impacts.
For Yunfan and Leah, on your project, I'm kind of watching that. I was thinking about King Canute and trying to roll back the tides. And is it realistic? Is this hope, the idea of actually salvaging China's villages? How realistic is that, or is it just the sort of fanciful hope of well-to-do urban people? Or from your research and work on this, what did you find? Is this something that could take on a life of its own and actually have significant impact in China?
I think it could have significant impact on the way that people who are still living in the villages perceive their lives. I mean, right now, when you're in the countryside, most people do want to move to the cities, and there's a sense of, that rural is backwards, and it's, I think for Oni, for our major character, his desire is as much to redevelop this village as it is to kind of spread through media in China domestically a different idea about what rural means and how it actually has value for China's future.
Yeah, as Oli has pointed out in the film, that the most important task for Bijan project is to turn this belief of rural life has no value and urban life equals to progress. Is to turn this belief because what Chinese government is trying to do in the next decade is still based on this belief that urbanization is the way to go. There's no value in whatsoever left in traditional rural life. So I think maybe it's not realistic to try to stop the, urbanization, the process of urbanization. But there are countries and areas on this earth that can strike a more balanced way between rural life and urban life. That's what they're trying to do.
And Sean, I think the one question I had for you is, given all of the work that you've done in China over the last 6 or 7 years, having the experience now of looking at some of these same issues, environmental issues in a different country, also highly populated, dense, what struck you, the differences between China and India, the awareness of the people, the government, the extent of the challenge that they face, having looked at this all over China and now seeing it in India?
Well, I've been looking at environmental issues in China since I moved there in 2006. And I feel that over that time, with every project that I've done there, I've started to understand the different environmental issues that I've covered, such as desertification, wetlands, biodiversity loss, climate change. And I really wanted to go to another country like India in Asia, one of the major 3 countries I feel, along with Indonesia, which I've recently traveled to as well, to try to understand how these countries, which are very similar in many respects, but also very different, how they are each dealing with these different challenges. And in India, my experiences were that the problems of the environmental issues and how they are affecting these communities, such as in Kanpur, were a lot more vivid and a lot more very much there in your face, very much ready to see. And the effects of this industry on the people were very graphic, as we saw from the piece. So for me, India has been very different in China, where I've been looking at more ecological issues, whereas this has been more about focusing on the effects of pollution. And for me, India I was very much surprised by some of the things that I saw there.
You're saying things that you saw in India that you think would not be allowed in China because more developed regulatory structure?
I think for me, personally, reporting on some of these issues would have been a little bit more difficult in China. I found it easier to find these stories in India. I found people to be a little bit more open and a little bit more willing to share their feelings and their stories about how these issues are affecting their communities. I traveled in India for a month, covering a few different stories. So I'm really at the beginning of starting to really understand India and how the relationship between the government, national and local government, plays into many of these factors. But it is very different to China and African base, but equally important to understand what's happening.
Well, maybe let's stay with Sean for a moment, but I'd like to hear from each of you about the challenges both for the reporting, but also the choices that you made as filmmakers, as putting together these documentaries, how you decided the decision that you made. Sean, maybe just stay with you for a moment on how you approached it. Why Kanpur? How did you find it? And what were the difficulties of getting in the regulatory structures you had to deal with?
Well, like with a lot of the projects, I do a lot of research for a couple of months before I even go to shoot these stories. And I had read about the issue of Kanpur in India. It's a story which has come up a lot in the Indian domestic media, but not so much in the Western media. So I was really interested to see if this issue was as serious as some of the articles had indicated it was. And as I mentioned before, I was very much shocked at the environmental and social impacts that this was having. And the fact that Kanpur just last year has become the biggest exporter throughout India of leather products, all of which, 95% of which I should say, are destined for the West. So when I got there and I started to see what was happening and see the clear effects on people, I really knew that this was a story I wanted to tell. And we were there for just under 2 weeks, and we visited the same communities every day, just kept building up the trust with the people that we met, the people that we ultimately photographed and interviewed, and informing them about what we wanted to do, what stories we wanted to tell. And for many of the residents, they felt that they were being very much ignored, and they were very happy to share their stories with us. So early on, within a couple of days of seeing Kanpur, the environmental impacts, the social impacts, I knew immediately that there was a really good story to tell, and then a really important story to tell.
Brendan, in your case, this was, Asbestos was one of several monotowns that you visited across Russia, and how you chose those, the difficulties of getting access, the permits to go into those cities.
Yeah, as you mentioned in the introduction, it's one of 340 monotowns across Russia, so one of the earliest challenges that we had was deciding which ones do we visit and why. And Asbestos, for very obvious reasons, seemed like the kind of place, at least from a Western perspective, that we might find at least some interesting stories and some interesting human interest stories. So we pretty quickly decided that other reporters had been there recently, but no one had spent any time. They were usually quick hit stories. So we thought we might go in and spend a little more time and see if we could find something a little deeper. And it was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. It was very quickly, we showed up on a Monday. We met a local journalist, we reached out to local officials, the company that runs the factory, trying to schedule interviews. And the next morning at 6 o'clock, the local FSB security folks were at our hotel asking what we were doing. Pretty soon after, we realized we were being followed around in a car that we couldn't quite figure out who it was that was following us. The people we were interviewing were receiving visits afterwards. One woman actually lost her job. So after a couple of days, we decided we had to get out of there. And if we were going to continue, we were going to have to do it in a much more low-key way. So we went back to Moscow and came back about 10 days later. Because we had met Nikolai. We had met Nikolai, I think the first day that we arrived. Just walking around town, getting a tour. We saw him doing the routine with the weights. That's something he does at the local House of Culture, where a lot of the cultural activities take place. And we were told that he was an interesting guy we should talk to, and he was. But he was pretty skeptical of us. He sat down for a short interview, and I went to visit him the next morning, and he said, "No, I don't really want to be a part of this anymore." His mother also works at the same factory, and she had been cautioning him. And coincidentally, my reporting partner, Anna, did a television interview on a national television channel from Asbestos while we were there on this topic. And he saw it, and a number of people in the town saw that interview. And he emailed us and said, "Okay, I understand now, and I want to talk." So I was able to go back and visit him and get his cooperation, even though his mother never did agree to cooperate. And as a result, because he lives with his mother, we couldn't film at his house. We couldn't stay in the town because we didn't want the security service knowing we were there. So I had to stay in a city about an hour and a half away. So presented a number of challenges to try to get the story done.
Leah, you had a great character in Oning who was hosting you and sort of welcoming you and wanting to tell the story, this intellectual editor from Beijing. But you also were dealing with the local people who were not accustomed to dealing with outsiders. And what were some of those challenges?
Well, I think the biggest challenge for me is, making them not really think about me being there anymore. And so we've been there I've been there 3 times now, and honestly, I don't think anyone even bats an eye, and I think we've gained a lot of trust, and that's been a really great experience. We really haven't had any difficulties filming in the village, and I think our biggest difficulty is there are so many different themes just crisscrossing in this one little village, and just trying to put together a story that touches on them and does them all justice has been complicated, but I think to choose to do it in a more character-driven way has been, I think we've been really happy with the result.
But no difficulties with local party officials, government officials, as far as just being there, what you're doing with the footage?
Well, when we originally went, we went for a different purpose. We went for to participate in the Harvestival in 2012 because I work at the Asia Society, and we were exhibiting a photography exhibition there. And that was right before the 18th Party Congress, and we had a lot of camera equipment with us to document the exhibition. And after our exhibition was in a nearby village, and we spent a week installing it with some villagers, and then the local government shut that down. But in terms of our project's only been more interesting because that really just got us thinking about what's going on here. And so ever since then, and actually the local officials, I think, are very supportive of Oning's project, despite being forced to cancel. I think it was probably the Beijing government that was forcing them to cancel the Harvestival.
One of the great things about down in the countryside is the animations, and that's Yunfan who did that. And tell us about your choices there. I mean, were you thinking of doing animations all along? I mean, it was a surprise to us. We didn't know that they were coming. They were great. I thought they added a lot to the documentary.
Thank you. Yeah, it wasn't a initial plan, but we were really struggling trying to find out the most efficient way to give all this context, the history, and the geographic information about this region in the shortest possible time. So, in the end, animation is the most effective way to do it. And I would say, like during the reporting process, the biggest challenge was actually get the villagers to talk about the topics we're interested in, because although most of the villagers are very open to us, but the things they want to talk about are, how great it is in the cities, how great it would be for us to move there. My children all live in the cities, and it's really hard to, get somebody like Zhang Yu. In the end, we found a character like Zhang Yu who's like can respond to Oning's and Bishan project's goal of doing something there. Yeah, that was our biggest challenge.
Questions? I think we have one over here.
I have two quick ones, very quick. One is on India. Are they tanning cow hides, and is that unusual in India, given that? So is it only in certain Muslim areas? Could you give me some context on that? And then the other one is for the China people. I work for the World Bank, and if you work for the World Bank for 2 seconds, you are indoctrinated in the idea that people's lives generally improve when they live in cities. It's better to get out of the rural areas. How widespread is this Bishan movement in China? The guy, your protagonist, has an Apple computer. He's clearly quite well off. Is this sort of a novelty project? Can you give me some context on that, how much of that is reality-based, people going back to the land? Thank you.
To answer the first one very quickly, the majority of the hides that are treated in Kampong are water buffalo, according to the people that we spoke to there. So in terms of any conflicts, I weren't aware of any conflicts from using water buffaloes.
So with the Back to the Land movement in China, it's definitely a very early stage emerging movement. The Zhou Jing, the co-founder of the project, he has made a map of all the different movements that he has researched in China, and I think there's 40 something? 56. But they range from everything from things like what they're doing to more of a local, like a CSA operation outside of a city. That's the more common level, I would say, of what's happening.
And as one of our characters Oning pointed out in the film, it is very hard for people to harbor a counter-urbanization idea if they have never lived in the city. So the people who are championing this cause are people from the urban area, and they are better off than the rural people.
Good evening. I got the sense of protagonists in the Russia and the Chinese story, but nothing from India. In terms of your film brought out obviously awareness of what's happening, but was there anyone in the community or in the village or in Kanpur that was taking on this issue and trying to figure out a way to solve it, or to work with the government or the businesses? Did you find any of those folks out there?
We did interview a holy man who has who is based next to the Ganges River and who's involved in education projects to try to get people to be more aware of some of these problems. But in the production of the piece, it didn't quite fit in, because during the time that we were there, there weren't any activities going on. What they actually do is they have in Kanpur a festival to raise awareness amongst the local population about protecting the Ganges and about protecting it from the waste that is produced from the tanneries, where they invite local community members, they invite tannery bosses, government, to talk about these issues. Unfortunately, the festival is on December the 25th, which is a slightly tricky one to get to, and we were there at the beginning of December, so they had that obviously at the end of December, so we didn't get that. But had we been there at that time, we would have liked to incorporate it into that piece. So there are a few community members trying to do something, but they're very much up against a force. They're finding it very hard to not compete against, but to work against.
But what about international NGOs or national NGOs? How much involvement do they have?
There is involvement. The only one local NGO was the gentleman that I interviewed, Rakesh Jaiswal of Eco Friends, and he's been based in Kanpur for many years, a couple of decades. And towards the end of the interview, I asked him, on a personal level, how do you feel after being here for so many years and working on these issues for so long? How does it actually make you feel on a personal level? And he just said, I'm tired because nothing is changing. And we interviewed more national NGOs in Delhi. We didn't incorporate into the piece either because it didn't quite work, but we incorporated them into the text articles that are on the Pulitzer Center website. And they also came back with the same opinion that even after so long, even though it's an issue within India which people know about, there's very little action and very little change in cities like Kanpur. Some international NGOs have been involved in trying to improve water quality in Kanpur, but again, it's quite limited action. And I think the action needs to come from within Kanpur, within the communities that are being affected.
Brendan, what about in Russia? So similar kind of question. Are there national groups that have taken an interest in what is happening in these monotowns and focusing on them at a national level?
I'm not aware of any civil society organizations that are involved in the issue in Russia, but the government itself does recognize that this is a problem. And they are attempting from time to time to incentivize people who are in towns that they feel just have no future. They incentivize them to leave, primarily to move to the Far East where there are fewer people and the jobs are relatively more plentiful and more highly paid. But most of the people that we ended up speaking to, because as I mentioned, my reporting partner Anna had done a television interview from Asbestos while we were there, because the government had just that day announced the policy that they were going to offer people up to, I think it was about $8,000 if they were willing to leave one of these monotowns and move to the Far East. But everyone we spoke to said, while they would love to take them up on the offer, that wasn't quite enough money to make them do it.
Brendan Vinci is working with Anna Netsova, who is also a grantee of the Pulitzer Center, a Russian freelance journalist. Of course, Leah was working with Yunfan, who is Chinese. Sean is on his own, but he's married to a Chinese. And maybe interesting to get your thoughts. I mean, Brendan's been based in Moscow, and Sean in Beijing for a long time. Leah and Yunfan are coming in from outside. So just functioning as freelance journalists, and to give us a sense of what it's like, what your experience has been, what you would say, looking back on having done it, and experience of living there, coming in.
Well, yeah, I think that the project we're doing in Bishan, and we hope to continue it, definitely, we're doing it from the outside because that's the reality of life, but I think that it requires a lot of time spent in the village. One of the advantages to coming from outside is that we can check in, a few times a year over an extended period of time. So I think we are hoping to see the types of change that happens over time. I think we won't really know what Onim and his project accomplish, until another year or two has passed. So I think in many ways this approach does allow us to see change a little bit more easily.
It's really fun to do this kind of reporting in rural China because people are very trusting, and the local government wasn't really intervening, because I think the more fame we bring to this village, actually, the better off the local government is. So our interests are actually in line. So nobody's actually reporting us to the authority, and nobody's asking to see our journalist certificates. So this can also be obstacles if you do this kind of reporting in urban China.
Well, I've been in Moscow for only about 8 months, which doesn't feel very long. There's a lot that's been going on in that time, so it's been a busy 8 months. Russia's not the easiest place to be a freelance journalist, especially as a foreigner. There's not really a mechanism as a freelancer to be credentialed as a journalist. So that is like a little bit of a concern for me at times. A lot of what I do, it doesn't necessarily come up, but there are times when a credential is necessary. So it's nice to be there, and I feel like I'm just starting to get my teeth sunk into some of the issues that are going on. I live in Moscow, but many of the more interesting stories that pique my curiosity are taking place in the regions outside of Moscow, where the majority of Russians actually live. So it's nice to be close and able to visit as many of those places as I can.
And what prompted the decision to move to Moscow?
Long-standing interest and good timing.
Sean?
Well, as I mentioned before, I've been based in China for 7.5 years now, and I first made my first trip there in 2005. And I think, as working as a freelance photojournalist, nowadays there are so many great photographers out there, and it's hard to find your own voice and find out what you really want to say. I studied zoology at college back in the UK, and I tried to use my interest in the biological sciences, environmental sciences, and bring that into my photojournalistic work. And partnering with an organization like the Pulitzer Center has been really invaluable for me over the past 4 or 5 years that we've been working together, because they've been able to give me time to work on these projects long term, to go into the field for up to 2 months at a time working on these issues in a climate where it would be nearly impossible to get the kind of funding that you need and the time you need from traditional media outlets to work on these kind of issues. And each project that I've done over the years has built on top of the last one. And I feel each project, because it's built upon the one before, has made each project better and has deepened my understanding of these, not only these issues, but also of China, which takes a lifetime, if not more, to understand. And in the past couple of years, I've now branched out, as I mentioned before, looking at Indonesia and India, and I feel my experiences reporting on China, trying to understand these issues and how it's affecting that country, has helped me, given me a frame of reference to approach these issues in other countries. So this is my focus, Asia and the environment. And I feel that by continuing on this line, it helps me build upon the stories that I've done before, no matter which country that they're in.
I keep looking for questions. This is a shy crowd, but the microphones are to the left and the right, and if you have questions, please go to the mics. And in the meantime, is this a question coming? An early exit. Here we go. Question on the right and on the left.
This is for Sean. Sean, in your piece with the Indian villagers, it seemed to me as if the villagers knew that their health was deteriorating, yet the industry, the business of leather, would still seem to be booming. So how do you see this solution? How do you see this quick fix of money and business helping their future, their lives?
Well, a lot of villagers who are being affected aren't involved as much in the local industry. They're local farmers, so the villages are a couple of miles just downstream of Kampala, just on the very outskirts. So they're receiving all the water which is funneling down towards them. I think from speaking to so many of them felt very helpless. Like the gentleman who works in the NGO, also the fact that they had seen no change. Most of them would tell us that nobody listens to them. Nobody cares about their story. So I hope that this piece, the video piece along with the articles and the photo essays that we are distributing, do raise awareness in in the way that it makes people question where their leather goods come from. I just came back from Ann Arbor, the University of Michigan, where I showed this video to many of the students there. I had one student go online or have some way of finding out where these products come from and what they are doing. Perhaps that can then put pressure on from that direction.
Thank you.
Question over here.
Yes, good evening. This is about China, and the country's amazing growth is very interesting. The GDP of China is about to surpass the United States either this year or next year. And what this movie was about, it seems to me, is at least some level of returning back to the land. And there's a lot of people here in this country who are starting organic farms and doing things like that. My question is, do you feel that the Chinese people look at the United States for any sort of political, economic model?
In terms of the Back to the Land movement?
Yes.
Yeah, I think Onin, the major character, he has expressed a lot of interest in different international movements, Back to the Land movements from the past. He's visited some intentional communities in New Zealand, and I believe he'll be in the United States meeting with a bunch of people this summer. And I think he's also even in Europe somewhere right now learning about intentional communities there as well. So I think he's very interested in seeing how other people have attempted this before.
Chinese people do look at America to look for economic and political models all the time. America is used as example to support, on both sides of an issue, typically. For example, GMO debate or the large-scale farming versus traditional farming. People will raise, on both sides, will raise America as example to support their point of view.
Your question over here?
Hey guys, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, about the Back to the Land movement, I was just curious, do you think that the U.S. could use something similar, and would that help with, I don't know, saving the environment, something like that? Thanks.
I think any sort of movement to connect people to where their food comes from and be more aware of your environment and sustainability and your carbon footprint is definitely needed in this country. It's needed a lot of places. And I think this type of thing, Yunfan and I are constantly looking at the parallels between what is happening now in China and what has happened in the past in the United States. And what's really interesting is that this sort of movement really emerged for the first time in the United States when the United States became more than 50% urban. So it's definitely a commonality that when people, at least in these two countries, when they reached that threshold, they started to question certain things. And so, yeah, I think the United States could definitely use another comeback for the parts of the Back to the Land movement.
Question on this side.
Yes, I have two questions for the China group. Number one, I know a lot about China, and I'm just wondering, how does the policy of government owning the land plus the Oku system affect the return to the land movement? And then the second question was, as the Chinese government has been trying to promote development and urban development further and further inland to get people away from the coastal cities, will that have an effect on, say, for instance, younger generations maybe working in the city but living with their parents in a more rural community?
The first question is about hukou system and Chinese government's policy.
Maybe explain the hukou system.
Yeah, hukou system, basically China has like two kinds of, two categories of citizens. One is the urban citizen and one is the rural citizen. And if you're registered as a rural citizen, it's very hard for you to get there are only a few ways you can change into a city citizen. For example, you can go to college and find a job in the city afterwards. Then you'll be somehow legitimized as a citizen. And for a lot of these migrant workers who migrate from rural villages to cities, without a higher education certificate, they cannot get a urban citizen ID, and a lot of their benefits are tied into this. For example, their health care and the right of their children to go to the schools in the urban area are all restricted. So it's a discrimination against actually rural citizens. And I think the other side of the first question was to ask the land title transfer. Was that right? So Chinese government right now is trying to allow similarly to citizens being categorized as urban citizen and rural citizen, the land is separated into two categories as well. So there are urban lands and farming lands. Farming lands cannot be used to develop into city apartment condos. But once the farming land being transferred into recategorized as urban land, they can be used for all kinds of business. And right now, Chinese government is trying to introduce this, trying to lift this switch so that people in the rural side can sell their land to become urban land. But this has huge consequences, and I think the government is very cautious in starting this process. And what was the second question?
The second question was, as the Chinese government pushes urban development inland, will that have an effect on
the Chinese
locals having farming communities there?
Right. As far as I can tell, the Chinese government tried to push the development to the inland, the west side and north side of China for at least like 15 years. Then they haven't been very successful. I think the focus now that I observe is trying to localize the urbanization process instead of develop all these super mega cities in Shanghai and Pearl River Delta. Right now they're trying to develop small towns all throughout China into smaller sized cities so that people can be urbanized nearby their village, I guess.
Marsha, another question?
Hi, John. I have a question about India's toxic tannery, so I guess it's Sean. So from what I understand, from Indian politics, is that the rural vote really counts for local politics, and the tannery would be an industry that kind of feeds into the local economy, right? And I think I noticed that you mentioned that there's a farmers cooperative. Is there any kind of pressure from these farmers to kind of divert this water, or maybe treat the water and the chemicals in it? Because again, their vote is really important, and that would kind of feature in a backward way as to what these tanneries and industries would have to do, right?
Yeah, that's what I thought. You would think that they would be listening to the Farmers Cooperative. The gentleman that we interviewed, Sonal Yadav, he was the head of the Farmers Cooperative there. And all of this water, we're talking a vast amount of water, as you saw from the video, that feeds onto their farmland. There's no way for them to treat that water. The treatment plant, which is used to treat some of the water, around only 20% gets treated, is run by local government. But again, Sonal Yadav told us that he has kept telling people, he speaks to local politicians, he tells them about what is happening, but nobody listens. And I also, like you, was surprised that people wouldn't listen to people like him who are key to the groups, the important groups within the area. But again, like many of the other people we interviewed, it was this sense of nobody will listen. even to groups of people that you would think would have some kind of voice.
Yeah, that's really interesting because rural vote banks are really important in India, so I'm finding this so surprising. But thank you.
So I had one other question. We've had all of you out in the schools all day today. Sean, as he mentioned, is out at the University of Michigan, and the rest of you here in the schools in DC. And we, as I said earlier, we think this is a really important part of our work to bring these global issues into schools and secondary schools and universities and get students thinking about these big global issues and also making connections to their own lives at home. But we also think, we like to think that this is useful for journalists as well. And Sean already mentioned something about what he heard, maybe the others, if you could just share a bit of any surprises today as you've made the rounds in schools here in DC, the kinds of things, the questions you got, the reactions from students here.
Well, yeah, I've used this film today to show students, middle school students and high school students, and use it as a spark for a conversation a little bit about their responsibilities that they might feel toward their community, which is a little bit of a tough sell, because most of those kids are ready to get on out of Washington, D.C., dreaming of greener pastures elsewhere. But there are a few. We had one boy today who had moved to Washington from Kansas City, Missouri, and he was the one who piped up and was very vocal and said that he missed his family in Kansas City, he missed that community there, and he was ready to go back. And I think that's actually a lot of the other students seem to really take that into consideration and look at this issue in a slightly different way, that they may go and spread their wings, but it's worth keeping in the back of your mind your responsibility toward your community. So I was surprised at how eager they were to leave, but at the same time, they're kids.
Brendan, can I just ask Brendan a follow-up question?
Sure. This is Amanda Ottaway, our education coordinator.
Hi. I just hung out with Brendan for 2 days, so I've had the pleasure of seeing that film many times. I wanted to ask about the narrative style of it and your choice for one character telling the whole story, as opposed to a whole lot of things going on. Just the simplicity of that, and maybe how you have found that resonating with audiences so far, and why you chose that style.
Well, it was a couple of factors that went into structuring the film that way. As I mentioned, it was not an easy place to work. So getting people to open up or even talk to us in the first place was a huge challenge. And when we found someone who was willing to spend time with us, we were working within a limited time frame, and quite honestly, to continue searching for more characters who would have probably just gone back to the security services or the local police or the factory security and mentioned that we were back in town, which is what I was trying to avoid. We went with what we had. And so in a lot of ways, though, it was really great. The kids did connect with this character. I was really shocked when I asked them what they learned about him, and they could rattle off 1, 2, 3, 4 different things that were all the key points that I was trying to communicate in the film. So I think that in that sense, for being, how old are 6th graders? Like 12 years old, they're very perceptive of those issues.
So, Yunfan and Leah, any shockers, surprises?
Yeah, I was really surprised by the appetite for information about China from the 6th graders in DC. And also, there doesn't seem to be any problem for them to relate to things going on in China. When we showed some photos of the left behind children in China, that is when their parents move from the villages to work as migrant workers in the cities, the children will be left behind in the village to be taken care of by their grandparents. And the 6th graders here immediately start to ask a series of questions, like who's taking care of them? Did you meet them? Are they happy? Are they okay? So that was really great to see.
Yeah, spending time with the 6th graders, I was definitely impressed by everything that they know about China. They've been learning a lot in this one school about globalization and injustice, and they know a lot about manufacturing, and I was very impressed. I think it shows definitely a shift in the times. I don't remember learning very much about China at all when I was in 6th grade. And yeah, they reacted really well, and I think one of the more interesting things was the relationship we all have between whether or not we want to be living in the cities or if we want to be living in the countryside. And I think that's, that definitely came across that those are things that the children have also been thinking about. And but it seems that the consensus was that DC has a lot of nice parks and things that make it much better than certain cities in China.
Well, we're almost at 8 o'clock. I want to thank our journalists for bringing these important issues so vividly to life. And I hope that you'll follow all our work via our newsletter or coming to our website or to events like this. I mentioned earlier the ebook Meltdown on Sean's work from China. We've also just issued Tarnished, an ebook on the environmental, social, and economic cost of gold. It features the work of 11 Pulitzer Center journalists in 8 different countries. That's on iTunes now and will soon come out on Amazon and other platforms. Take a look at those and our other ebooks. We think that they're an amazing platform for the great photography, the video, and the writing in Pulitzer Center projects, and all the proceeds from sales go directly to our journalists. I want to thank all my colleagues at the Pulitzer Center for pulling this event together, and also our friends at the Environmental Film Festival for the great work they do and for making this evening such an important part of our work each year. And lastly, thanks to all of you for coming out tonight in the middle of this last gasp of snow for this winter, we hope, and for your interest and for your excellent questions. And we are having a reception just across the hall in the Rotunda area, and I hope that all of you will stay for some food and drink and some conversation. So, thanks very much for being here.